Today I'm speaking with Jonathan Pierce. Jonathan, thank you so much for joining me today.
Hello.
And it's great to have you back. You have been here before on the Harmonic Atheist channel, and I'm so glad to touch base with you again. And today we're going to be, I'll give everyone a bio in a second, but today we're going to be focusing on this book, Jonathan's new book, The Resurrection, A Critical Examination of the Easter Story. And I love it. And I want to go into some of the details of it, but it's also a bookend, right? You had the Nativity book as well, correct?
Yeah, that's really important to say as well. So I wanted to look at the life of Jesus in terms of historicity. And if you're going to do that, really, there's only two areas of his life that intersect with actual history, which is the Nativity, because you've got the census and Herod and all these claims that only two of the gospel writers make, and then you've got the resurrection. So you've got Pontius Pilate, and you've got resurrection techniques, crucifixion techniques, and all these sort of execution techniques and burial customs, which are real historical facts of the past that we can check and verify, and then the claims about them from the gospel authors in terms of how Jesus was killed and so on and so forth. And then so here we have these two bookends to his life that we can analyze in terms of history. But the rest of his life, of course, you can't. And I've said this many times before. It's if you find these two areas where there is intersection with history and you find these to be problematic, so the Nativity and the resurrection, then what can we say about all those claims in the middle, his whole ministry? If there aren't verifiable claims in there, the wedding of Cana, who was there? How do we know? Blah, 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 blah. What were the sources? What were the actual claims? They end up just being nebulous assertions without any grounding. And then when you say, okay, if they seem nebulous assertions without any grounding, you might be able to believe them if these two bookends can really stand on their own merits. But if they can't stand, if the Nativity and the resurrection fall away as historical claims, then the whole thing is problematic.
Yeah, I love it. I'm looking forward to diving into this with you in a second. I did just want to give everyone a brief bio as well, if you don't know Jonathan Pierce. By the way, do you usually like to be introduced with MS in the middle, Jonathan MS Pierce?
I do, only because for people from Britain, there is a famous soccer commentator called Jonathan Pierce. And in fact, I once was debating on my blog I think some apologist who did a whole piece on me, and then he went to Wikipedia and he got a picture of the football commentator. He's like, Jonathan Pierce, and I was like, mate, that's not even me.
That's awesome. Fantastic. Well, it's funny. I've had a few times like that where I'll look up somebody's name and you could easily see them being mistaken. I think there might be a fighter with your name too. Like
yes, there is. Yeah. UFC. Yeah.
Yeah. Well, this Jonathan Pierce, Jonathan MS Pierce, is an agnostic atheist teacher / philosopher from South Hampshire, UK. He would be described as a student of all manner of things philosophical and theological, and he finds the subject of the existence of God an all-consuming and obsessive one. And we've talked about some of that before in our last interview, especially the issue of free will. And in terms of education, he had a master's in philosophy from the University of Wales, a degree as well from the University of Leeds, and a postgrad certification of education from the University of St. Mary's in Twickenham, which I just love saying that word, Twickenham. Is that the right way to say it, by the way?
It is. That was pretty good.
Pretty good. I can't claim to be British, but I love the way you all say stuff. And by the way, how do you say Worcestershire sauce? What's the right way to say it?
Not like that.
Not like that.
Almost any other way but that. Worcestershire.
Yeah. Worcestershire. Okay. That's awesome. And you're also a founding member of the Tippling Philosophers, which is a friendly group of disparate believers and non-believers and sort of believers based in Hampshire. And you're a big advocate of casual philosophy groups meeting over a good pint of ale. I'm imagining that it must be frustrating as can be to be having to put that on hold with COVID, but I hope you all can get back to that shortly.
Well, funnily enough, actually, it's been our most fertile period because we've been Zooming, and actually it's much easier to get people together on Zoom than down a pub. It turns out, especially when people have got different schedules, and you can schedule it in, and then people don't have to leave their houses. They just need to get a couple of beers in, and then job done.
That's awesome. And you also there with your partner, you have twin boys. And how old are they, by the way?
10.
Nice. So you have a busy household, and
Yep.
you also have done many public speaking engagements discussing philosophy, religion, skepticism, and debating different topics related to this. I wanted to also just, I don't want to go too far off topic here, but just want to give a brief bio for your books. You have a book on free will with a much longer title, but it's called Free Will. A book called The Little Book of Unholy Questions, The Nativity of Critical Examination, which we talked about. Beyond an Absence of Faith, stories about the loss of faith and the discovery of self. 13 Reasons to Doubt, The Problem with God, quote unquote, classical theism under the spotlight. Did God create the universe from nothing? Countering William Lane Craig's Kalam cosmological argument. Survival of the Fittest, Metamorphosis. Not Seeing God, Atheism in the 21st Century. And then could you round that out by telling us about the Curse of the Maya series and how that's doing? I've heard some good things about that.
Yeah, so actually it's a children's book, sort of 9 to 14 maybe age range. And myself and a teaching friend decided they changed the curriculum in Britain and decided to throw in the Maya. So all these schools had stuff on the Aztecs. And then they went, well, you're not going to teach the Aztecs, you're going to teach the Maya. And everyone was like, brilliant, thanks. We spent 20 years getting together resources for that. So my mate was like, what can I do about this? I said, well, do you know what? If you want something doing, you got to do it yourself. Yeah. If you want to do a good job, do it yourself. So we decided to write one ourselves, got to know the English and the history curriculum, but also some philosophy for children. So putting some really interesting kind of times where the children go, I'm going to have to think about that, which I think is really, really valuable. And then wrote this book. And because we were quite cynical on how we wrote it, like to tick a load of boxes, but also to write a damn good book. It's doing really well, and classes are taking it on and using it up and down the country, and people have got display boards of me and my friend Andy. You know, and this is just a bizarre thing. You know, you get sent videos of these children like reading out their predictions of the story and saying, Johnny, we really enjoyed this. How did you write this character, and what did you do here? And you know, I've got these children asking me, inspired to write, and asking me these questions about characters that we've made up, and it's lovely. It's really, really nice.
That's so cool. That's so cool. Well, on that note, if anyone does want to look deeper into these books, especially the last one, The Curse of the Maya, there, I'll have the link beneath our video for your Amazon page. And please, go check them out. And then the other ways to connect with you with the Tippling Philosophers blog. I'll have those links as well. I wanted to kind of give you a segue here by saying, I have heard a rumor that you have a dragon in your bathtub upstairs. And I just want to say that sounds like an extraordinary claim, but I'm willing to believe it just purely because you said so. Well, and with that, I'll let you take the floor.
Nice. So we'll get onto that in a second, actually. Well, what I think I'll do, if I may, is just take you through the chapters in this book, the one that you've beautifully showed everyone, and just take you through my approach to deconstructing the resurrection, and we'll shortly get onto that dragon claim. So the way I start the book is why is this important? Why is it important for me to take apart the resurrection claims? So, and this goes back to Paul, but also modern day thinkers like William Lane Craig, who see the resurrection as absolutely critical for the Christian faith, which is to say, if you think about Jesus and you ask the question, why did Jesus exist? That's an interesting question, but it's going to get you somewhere around, in order that he died and was resurrected, and the dying was in some way payment for sin, some kind of atonement, and the resurrection has this meaning, so on and so forth. So the whole Easter story is absolutely crucial to Christianity. Because if you didn't have Jesus atoning for the sins of humanity and Jesus dying and resurrecting in some divine manner, then all you've got is a guy purportedly doing a bunch of miracles around the Middle East, which is like, well, that's 10 a penny. So it's hugely important. And if you, which is why people like William Lane Craig use it as one of their pillars for their apologetics. So he would say the empty tomb is massively important. Here's all the historical foundation for the empty tomb, because that itself acts as a foundation for the resurrection story. So I'm going to put loads of effort into that, because actually, if I can show that it's historically probable that this happened, then that gives me a real advantage for persuading people that actually Christianity has a leg to stand on, compared to all these other religious claims out there.
Hmm.
So
can I just clarify?
Yeah.
So what you're talking about there is this question of, like, the Christian theology would say that Jesus was God, in a Trinitarian sense, he was God from eternity past, but that there was within this, Godhead, there were three distinct persons, one of whom, named Jesus, he did something very specific that the other two aren't known. Like God, we wouldn't say God the Father died or the Holy Spirit died. We'd say Jesus died. Jesus became incarnate. So what you're asking is a question of, what have people been saying over the centuries, especially early on? What were they saying as the specific purpose? Like, why did Jesus have to become a man? And then what was he doing, to, whether it was to appease God or to buy us back from Satan, or to satisfy God's glory and his wrath and his white hot holiness? You're diving into that. Is that right in that section?
Well, so actually, I want, so a lot of these books quite often deal with either distinctly the historical claims involved, or maybe some of the theological claims, but not often the philosophical claims. So I wanted to draw all of these together. So actually, it's really interesting and right that you brought up the Holy Trinity, because the resurrection is true only if really the Holy Trinity makes sense. So I start by saying, well, the Holy Trinity doesn't make sense, right? No one's made sense of it, which is why one of the prevailing theories is Mysterianism, which is, I don't know how it works, but it has to work. And I don't need to know how it works. All I need to know is that it does work. It's this kind of weird assertion that I find really unconvincing, but actually most Christians seem to adhere to, because no one can really explain the Holy Trinity without committing heresy or kind of getting themselves in a real muddle. So in the end, most, I think, honest thinkers, Christian thinkers, just step back and say, I don't really know, but it works, all right. And so I start by saying, well, that's a huge problem. And then I look at a bit of philosophy and say, well, you have this other added problem of, and this gets onto the atonement. So when I say that Jesus existed in order for the atonement to happen, and then you start thinking, well, why would God create the world in which people fail, and then kind of split himself up in some way where part of him has to go down to earth, you know what I mean, be incarnated as human and then die in order to pay for the failure of humanity, which is something that God designed and created and knew would happen in advance, if you believe in divine foreknowledge, advance of creating. So he's created this faulty thing, and then demanding payment from the faulty thing he's created, or demanding payment from the universe, or from he's demanding payments somehow for his poor design and creation.
Yeah, it's like he's saving us from himself.
Yeah.
By killing himself.
Just when you start thinking of it in these terms, when you really start grappling with the atonement, and you start thinking of it in the philosophical terms of a perfect being supposedly designing and creating everything in existence, which is then supposedly contingent upon this perfect being, then none of it starts making any sense. It's just bonkers. So I look at this and say, you've got, before we even start looking at resurrection, and before we even actually start looking at atonement, you've got this real problem of design and creation. So here's a bit of philosophy. Now, I don't think you can solve this, but if you're a Christian, you're going to have to just park this away for a little bit, because none of this makes any sense, and I think terminally so. And then you're going to say God created humanity, and then you're going to say, but humanity's a bit crap, and then you're going to say, and as a result of that falling short of perfection, God somehow demands payments. So therefore, Jesus is incarnated as a human and supposedly dies, and in that somehow works as a payment. And then you say, okay, well, how does that work? How does atonement work? And then you look at the history of atonement and the fact that, or the history of the theology of atonement, and you see that there are all these different theories again. And it's almost like Mysterianism again, which is, well, I'm not quite sure which one's definitely true, but there must be one.
Yeah. Because
atonement must work. Because if I don't have atonement, I don't really have any need for Jesus to do work.
And at the end of the day, whatever one they would think through, if they'd even think through it to that level, because I don't think a lot of Christians do it, the lay people, but at the end of the day, they're going to all claim my hope, my glory is that I swapped my sin problem for Christ's righteousness. Why he did that and however he did it, whether he literally went to hell and paid off the devil, or he just, satisfied God's wrath, whatever it looked like, I get to be in the court of heaven. Even while I'm still a sinner, I get to be declared righteous in God's sight. Therefore, I've got peace with God. And therefore, that's what I'm going to swing out into eternity onto is my hope in that. And it's crazy that they don't dive into what you're doing, where you're saying, well, what's actually happening though?
Yeah, and I think it's a really interesting point. A bit of a sidebar here, but I think there's an awful lot of lay Christians here, not the sort of people you talk to, and most of the people we're talked to in the work that we do, but your lay Christian who's out in society, who put on a census that they're Christian, and you say, well, who's Jesus? And they say the Son of God, and by that they actually mean the physical son, somehow as the biological son of God, because that's how they understand the theology. And that's of course completely bonkers. We know son of God is a term. We know it doesn't mean that Jesus was the actual son of God, but actually there's an awful lot of Christians who do think that. And then you start thinking, well, if most Christians don't really understand the basics of the theology here, we have a really bizarre scenario where most Christians, or a lot of Christians, aren't really properly accessing the revelation. So what does that say? And then you say, well, this is really difficult. Like if I need a degree in theology to understand how the atonement works and to understand how this works, then Christianity appears to be elitist. It appears to be like you can only really properly access the wonders of how all the theology works if you've got a degree in theology and you spent 60 years in a monastery studying it or something. You know what I mean?
Yeah, with the knowledge that you might still be wrong.
Yeah, so you need to have literally the physical brain and acumen to be able to deal with that, and then you need to have put in the effort, have the desire to, and put in the effort of learning all this stuff. I mean, I think it's just crazily elitist.
And I think I think a lot of people do just take it with that simple faith sense of like, I don't know much in this world, but I know two things. I'm a horrible sinner and Christ is a wonderful savior. That's where they park their lives and their soul. And yeah, but it's really, there is a lot of, I was reading your list and I'm just going to read through here as we wrap up this section. Ransom from Satan, recapitulation theory, Christus Victor, satisfaction theory, penal substitution, moral government theory, moral transformation, moral example theory, scapegoat theory, other theories. And there's other stuff there that I'm sure you could dive into in that last section, but there's a lot of moving parts here and it's not really clear why he had to die. And I would just add in my own little personal thing that I go back to a lot is, why does blood, and I know this is not about the resurrection as much, but why does it have to be blood? Like, why does he have to have blood? Why can't he just say, I forgive you? Like, what does blood magic have to do with this? And it's really, no one can seem to answer that. And they seem to be very ready to ignore that it came from Egypt. It's like, what?
Yeah, exactly. So you might then start seeing it in the context of, either Yom Kippur or some kind of, the burnt offerings of the Old Testament and so on and so forth. So it makes sense in that context, but then that's really old school and parochial and pretty unsatisfying. So when you look at the modern understanding of forgiveness and love and all this, then it's, I don't know, it's rather bizarre. But the atonement's interesting because whatever atonement a Christian picks is broadly going to reflect the kind of politics they're involved in as well, I think. So if you're quite a conservative evangelical, you're very punitive in the way you look at things, you're going to pick a penal substitution, the theory of atonement. Whereas if you're a lovey-dovey liberal Christian, you're more likely going to say it's a moral example theory where Jesus is just being an exemplar of great moral rectitude and
dying to yourself and loving other people no matter what.
Exactly. So I think, these are competing theories. No one can really establish one theory over another absolutely 100%. And it just depends with the sort of person you are, really. So once you've got over this whole problem of atonement and saying, well, the atonement doesn't make sense, and especially if so, and the example I use is imagine you're an amazing scientist, right, Tim? You work in this lab and you create this sentient being, and before you create it, you've designed it, and you say, I know that when I create this, actually most of these sentient creatures will leave my lab, go out and create havoc and rape and pillage in the village out there. Some of them will do some really nice things. A couple of these sentient beings might paint some lovely pictures and do some charity work, but most of them are going to be pretty terrible. And you create those sentient beings anyway in your lab, indubitably knowing that what will happen. And then they go out and cause havoc in the town around you. And then you get the police knocking on your door. You know, I think they have every right to say, we're going to arrest you because you have moral responsibility for creating these things that have gone wrong, right? These sentient creatures that you know 100% before you created them, they were going to go and do what they did, and they went and did what they did, and that was terrible. So God has moral culpability here. And this goes back to the whole problem with the atonement about paying himself for his own design problems, blah, blah, blah. So we just have this huge mess, right? And you say, you need to clear this mess up before you even start talking about the resurrection. My opinion is that that's all terminal. So the resurrection is irrelevant, you know, because none of the theology and the philosophy makes any sense at all. But okay.
That's a great point. Can I just add this one side example? Even if there was no police to come get you, like if you were to describe yourself as a father, which he does, like what if he's the father and Adam and Eve are his children, what father is going to put a viper in the nursery with his kids or let the viper in? Like, this doesn't make sense. This you got a psycho God from day one in this story.
And divine foreknowledge. So if he knows exactly how humanity is going to react, divine foreknowledge, I think, is one of the biggest thorns in the side of Christians and Christian theology, because it renders almost all of creation pretty bizarre. Once if you understand that he knew 100% what would happen in any all counterfactuals, all kind of, if this happens, then that happens, and he designs and creates it anyway, then he can't get upset about anything. He knows it's all going to happen, and he's designed it to happen anyway. He's designed plate tectonics to do what they do. He's designed people to have the urges to commit crime and to do this. Mate, it falls, you know, the buck stops with God.
Yeah.
Absolutely.
And when you merge that foreknowledge with the whole idea of election, which I think you talked about a second ago, but you know, the Bible says that the path to life is narrow, and very few make it. The path to destruction is wide, and many go there. If he knew that, then if he's the one electing it, then he literally set up a system where, you know, whatever you call 80%, 90% of people are just created purely to burn. Yeah, that's it.
So if you believe in a literal hell, which again is problematic, and if I was a Christian, I wouldn't. But if you do, then you have to say that God is literally creating most humans in order to just send them into the burning rubbish heap of Gehenna. You know, so it's
or best to be annihilated and to never get the point of existence. Yeah,
exactly. So this is where we get onto dragons. So you forget all that, right? Because that's too problematic for the Christians to deal with. So let's just look at the claims of the resurrection and the historicity thereof. So if I was to say to you, Tim, and imagine you don't really know me, you know me a bit, but you know that I probably wouldn't lie to you too much. And I say, I've got a kid. And you go, all right, yeah, nice one. What's her name? I say, you know, Jimmy or whatever. And you say, yeah, brilliant. And I've given you a verbal attestation. I've given you this claim, and that's not very improbable. So my verbal attestation is good enough for you to believe it. Yeah, fair enough, whatever. If I then say to you, oh, Tim, I've got a dragon that lives up in my bath, along with a dancing skunk who wears a pink tutu, and every Tuesday they fly to the moon and sing Rule Britannia. You'll go, whoa, hang on, mate. I believed you on the kid thing. That's fair enough. But that's wildly improbable and also breaks known natural laws. What am I going to do with this? So the first claim has a very high prior probability, which is to say that without looking at any evidence, the likelihood of my claim being true is pretty high, especially given that I'd have no reason to lie to you about that, blah, blah, blah. Second claim, the prior probability, which means, again, without looking at any evidence, what's the probability of a claim like this being true? Wildly improbable claim, right? So what do you do with this? How do you get from this being a wildly improbable claim to it being probably true? You need a stunningly good standard of evidence. For that claim, you would need at least video attestation, probably video attestation of several layers of independent, reliable experts, and probably seeing it firsthand yourself. In other words, extraordinary claims require extraordinary evidence. It's this maxim that Christians don't like because it doesn't work in their favor, but it's true, right? And we use it all the time. If someone tells you something outrageously untrue, you'll say, yeah, right, I need a bunch of evidence to support that. And if someone tells you something nominally, you know, probable, true, I've got a table, you know, they're like, yeah, whatever. So this is true, right? Extraordinary claims require extraordinary evidence. The question is, given the claims of the resurrection, and you can talk about resurrecting, dying, resurrecting God-man spirit figure. You can talk about earthquakes, renting of the temple veil, zombie spirits parading around Jerusalem, that apparently everyone saw, it going dark for 3 hours or whatever. You've got all these kind of crazy claims. You need exceptionally good evidence for these claims to be for the belief that these claims are true to be the most, you know, probable explanation of the data. Now, the question is, are the Gospels exceptionally good evidence?
Before you answer that question, can I just throw in a side note to that, what you just said? I would just, if I could be so bold, I would add, we need extraordinary evidence, but especially when we have very similar claims from other groups that the people that accept this extraordinary claim reject. In other words, if we know that you know, Dionysius easily transforms water into wine, and even, you know, says some of this, you know, some of the same things that the gospel says were literally like word for word said by Dionysius, or Odysseus in the Homeric epics goes to Hades and, you know, is able to come back out of it. And endless parallels, you know, some of them very, very tight, some of them were just generic ideas. But when you reject all these others that are very extraordinary, but kind of in a similar bucket, but this one, you're going to, you know, kind of beg me to say, please accept this one, but I'm okay. We all agree these are garbage, but this one is right. It's kind of like, why? Like, why are you willing to reject all these others? To which you would, as a, you know, Mr. Christian, Mrs. Christian, you'd say, I do require extraordinary evidence. If you're going to tell me that Dionysius was real and he really could, you know, do all these miraculous things and turn water into wine, I'm not going to believe that anytime soon. There's no way. I think that's mythology. But this one, where he does the same exact thing, nah, that's legit. And that's, I would just add that it seems like it's really difficult for Christians to separate those or to put those together in a right way and say, to basically to defend themselves, because it's the same exact kind of story.
You're absolutely right. So this is what starts forming your prior probability, which is to say that if previously we've had 200 claims of a similar ilk to this, and you believe them, you, Mr. Christian, believe them to be false, or anyone, you know, believe them to be false, then the prior probability of this being false, without looking at any of the evidence, probability is that this is going to be false, because actually it's simple betting. It's like the form of horses, right? Where if this horse has lost the last 100 races, then this next race is probably likely to lose without looking at any evidence at all. If it's never won a race,
yeah,
then betting for this horse is a pretty stupid thing to do. I would need some pretty amazing insider evidence about this horse and about this race in order to know with some degree of confidence in advance, or to be able to predict with some degree of confidence in advance that this horse would win. Now, goes back to the Gospels. Are these the level of evidence that we should expect in order to believe the claims therein? And then when you start looking at Paul through the Gospels, and you start looking at their provenance, when you start looking at the fact that they're written in unknown places at unknown times by unknown authors with ex post facto agendas, that means that they already come to believe he's a Messiah and then write the history of this guy. It's all so problematic. We can make guesses about some of these things, but the provenance is poor. The historical methodology used by the authors is poor compared to even contemporaneous historians in the Greek and Roman world. So the extraordinary claims require extraordinary evidence. These are extraordinary claims, but the evidence is exceptionally poor. It's not that these are we're wondering whether they're quite good enough. These are poor levels of evidence. You've got Luke saying that he admitting he's not an eyewitness. None of them were eyewitnesses. I would argue, it depends who you believe, Richard Balcom and whatnot. But for me, clearly, none of them are eyewitnesses. This is some degree of hearsay at best. They're making unverifiable claims. They weren't verified either, so they're both unverified and unverifiable. People couldn't have verified them, and no one did verify them.
Yeah,
it's just the level of evidence is poor.
And even on a really oversimplification level, we don't even know who these authors were, and there's probably a good argument to be made that they weren't named Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John.
Oh yeah, no.
Like we don't even know who these people were, what their names were, or was it a committee of people? Was it 6 guys? Was it 100 guys? Who was doing this, and then who redacted it? Like it's like you can't even go into the evidence per se in the fullest sense, because you don't even know where this thing came from. I mean, this is as good as introducing. Any kind of book. It's like I need to know who the author was, what their research was, who did they talk to. We don't know any of that stuff.
It's like me being a David Koresh, Waco cult. I believe that David Koresh was the Messiah. I never met him. I just believe he's a Messiah through being evangelized to, and then writing his history maybe in 30 years' time. But not having access to telephone, internet, anything like that, blah, 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 writing this history, making these massive claims. And the people I'm writing to have no way of verifying the claims I make. Neither do they seem to want to. So if you look at some of the work of Richard Carrier in Not the Impossible Faith, he does a really good job of saying that actually people readily believe things without, they might not have, they were both unverifiable, like they couldn't verify some of the claims, but also there's evidence to say they didn't verify. They didn't have the desire to, they just believed a lot of things, prima facie. And so, if I was that person writing about the history of David Koresh, would I be a reliable source of his life? And the answer, given that I'd already come to believe he's a Messiah, my agenda, my purpose for writing is to evangelize to you and make you believe what I believe. So I've got a clear agenda, which is going to hugely impact my writing. Is it a reliable source? No, it's not. Well, the Gospels aren't a reliable source, clearly.
That I feel like that's what you just said is probably one of the biggest things on my mind these days. I'm working on a lot of presentations, but one of them is just a list of things that I would call the need for scope for the imagination, which is a kind of a quote from the Anne of Green Gables books. But like Christians can't imagine that this might be made up. Like they can't imagine, for example, what Richard Carrier presents as the origin story for the Christ character, or a lot of others. Ways that we've had this explained to us. Certainly Dennis MacDonald's work, where it's a copy of rewrite of the Iliad and the Odyssey. But it's almost like it's like you can't tell someone, hey, I want to dive into where this might be copied from or borrowed from, or where the structure came from of the story, or the fact that the Mark has the zodiac in the right order woven into it as the structure. Like it's almost like you have to say, before we talk about any details, I want to ask you as a Christian, are you willing to open your mind to just the idea that this story might have been different and might have been formed differently by different people for a different purpose, with different facts than you ever imagined? Like it's almost like if you were to say, for example, what if you found out as a Christian that when you see Jesus cleansing the temple, and then in the other one it cleanses it twice, whichever one you want to pick or harmonize, if he cleanses it, what if that's a rewrite of Jacob Maccabeus or whatever his name is, where he cleansed the temple of the Greek idols? What if they're just basing it on that character? And what if Jesus really is making water into wine as a copy of the Dionysius story, or whatever other stories are like that? What if, just the what ifs, what if this is different than you thought? And I found a lot of people, that's like the stumbling block. They're not as much stumbling on saying, I see the parallel or I don't, or I'm willing to look at it or I'm not. Just they can't even have that first step that says, this might not be what I thought it was.
When you are approaching someone who believes a set of things and you're saying, well, this might not be true, or how have you looked at it in this way? one thing that's worth taking into account is something called terror management theory. So this is to say that when I approach someone and say this aspect of the resurrection might not be true, or the age of the earth might actually be this and not what you think, they are unable to take that in isolation as a rational debate on these particular details, because what you're really doing is you're saying, I've got good evidence to say that this isn't true, but in you accepting that this isn't true, I'm actually challenging your access to immortal life in heaven. And that suddenly becomes a much bigger thing. So it's not like, that could be a rewriting of the Dionysus, but if I start thinking like that, then it all falls apart. And actually, I'm not going to go to heaven. Like there is either no heaven or I'm going to go to hell, right? And so this becomes a much bigger thing than me just having this pleasant little theological and historical debate with Tim Mills, right?
Yeah, it's like you got 1,000 dominoes and you're saying, can I have permission, please, to knock the first one down? It's like it's not just one; it's a whole bigger picture.
It's what happens with death. So it's like, actually, I'm not beating you in this argument. I'm beating you in the argument as to whether you're going to live eternally in heaven, and you can't handle that. So because you can't handle that, you can't let any crack in that armor, be allowed. So it's deeply psychological.
Yeah. Can I ask? I will admit on your next section here, I am woefully inadequate to the topic of Bayes' theorem. Could you explain that and how that relates to this topic?
Well, so I broadly have done that. I mean, I won't go into too much detail. I just think the easiest way, unless you really want to go into the facts and figures of it, the easiest way to understand it is extraordinary claims require extraordinary evidence, which is to say, when you've got really low prior probabilities. So the what you were saying about all these comparative mythologies being obviously false, and you as a Christian believe they're false, and you accept that these are all false, and you've got another one, and you're now saying, well, this is true, and it involves breaking the natural laws, and it involves really crazy claims. That's a really low prior probability. We can all agree on that, right? So in order to overcome that low prior probability, you need very high posterior probability, very high quality evidence. And then you start saying, well, is this high quality evidence? No. So it's an application of Bayes' theorem, which really looks like extraordinary claims require extraordinary evidence. Okay, so it's a way of digging deeper into the probabilities aspect of this. Yeah, and when you start comparing different theories, and you can plug numbers into Bayes' theorem to come out with, well, actually, this is more likely as an explanation of the data than this. So which hypothesis is more likely? So basically, that's what I'm doing in the book, is by saying this is a supernatural claim, which given all the other supernatural claims that we've found to be completely false, of the same ilk as this is clearly likely to be false. And the claims that are coming out from the Gospels, what best explains these claims? Is it best explained by accepting them as being true, that actually these are true claims and this actually happened? Or is there something else that we can offer to explain the data of the Gospels that is far more probable? And I would say that almost anything you offer is more probable, because breaking the natural laws of the earth, and then making claims about divine God, man, spirit figures that don't make any sense theologically and philosophically, and then blah 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 blah, means that actually that's not very probable. Yeah. Really, which is exactly what you do with the Muhammad story, Christian. You say that and the Muslims will say this has got great provenance and blah blah blah, and you say, actually no, it's poor quality source, poor quality evidence, and those supernatural claims are bonkers. You're happy to do it with that religion, just as you said earlier, Tim. You're happy to do it as special pleading. You're happy to do it with that religion, but you won't apply that to yours. And going back to, I was going to say, the terror management theory thing is prevalent, but also what I believe that also happens with many Christians, but not people who come to Christianity from another religion, but lifelong Christians, is that you are taught these things as a child. And I think we talked about this before, which is you take on, oh, Noah's Ark, yeah, wonderful, I've got a nice little song, blah blah blah, that's of course that happened. I'm 5 years old, yes, I'm going to sing a song, brilliant. And then you get to like 15, 16, 17, 18, you start learning how the world works and how it clearly doesn't work. But because that's already lodged in your cultural memory, the baggage of your life, you don't test that. You don't put that through the test. It's just in there, that's done. And then when you hear Muhammad winged chariots and all this kind of stuff, that's a load of rubbish. That, and it's like, hang on, you believe like Noah's Ark and all the animals on earth 2 by 2 and blah blah blah. And so a lot of claims get through the back door when we are young and they aren't challenged. And then when we learn how to analyze and evaluate the world in terms of what's probable and improbable, we do that on all these other religions, but not on our own. And in fact, John Loftus had a look at this in his fantastic book, The Outsider Test for Faith, which is a very simple concept, but he delivers it in a really powerful way. It's a fantastic book, which is that we're very good at testing all these other faiths, but not very good at testing our own.
Yeah. I thought too, on that note, a lot about how we would have, as Christians, called everybody else a cult. The Mormons are a cult, JWs are a cult. Certainly some of the really extreme ones are called. Scientology is certainly a cult. And it's amazing when you get out of it, you're like, you know what? For me to have called all these other people a cult, but then be okay with all this crazy stuff, like, how could I not see it? And it's a real good testament to the effectiveness of early childhood psychological manipulation and brainwashing. It's just it's a case study that's all over the world, everywhere. We all in some ways went through it, but like we are preying on these innocent minds who don't have the ability to figure out what's real and what's not. And especially when you add in the sheltering, like, everyone around you is agreeing with this for the most part.
We're programmed to believe our elders. And so then when your elders are telling you this is true, you're like, well, this is true. Yeah.
Can I ask, I know we have the next section here with the Gospels and the 4 newspaper accounts, but just to wrap up the probability issue, one of the objections a lot of people give is, like, they might, if they were in this discussion, they would say, you know what, Tim, Jonathan, God bless you for your efforts, but you know what? You're missing the point. You got to have faith. You just got to have faith. And they would add to it, if you knew the glory, like I had even someone write me this week, if you actually had a relationship with the Alpha and Omega of the universe, and once you know you've had it, you're in a relationship with the living Christ, the living God, these things would drop. You got to have faith. I'm sure you get that from time to time from people. How do you handle those kind of conversations when they come up?
Well, I was talking with Andy Hall recently, and this came up actually, which is, the first thing I'd say is, what do you think faith really is, right? Because I can't see it as any other thing other than belief absent of evidence. So I look at believing something is full of mainly evidence, and then a little bit of faith for me. Or it depends what it is, right? So, for example, the claim that, I don't know, you exist as another human being in actual, objective reality. I have to have a little faith that that I'm not a brain in a vat, right? So there is a bit of faith with all of us, because Descartes came up with this, I think therefore I am. So you could be in a dream, an evil demon could be planting like stimuli into your brain and blah blah blah, and I can't prove that's not happening. It's the Matrix.
In the Matrix.
I can't prove I'm not in the Matrix. So that is faith. I basically have a bit of faith that I'm not in the Matrix. I can't prove it either way, but I don't have good reason to think I am in the Matrix. But whatever. So a little bit, but then after that, I'm going to use evidence to really come to my conclusion that Tim Mills exists, right? So bosh. Now, the problem is, some other things. So if I talk about the Christian claims of the resurrection being true, I would say it's the other way around. Now, what this looks like then is, sorry, this is really like school kid stuff. So there's a lot of faith in there and very little evidence. Okay. Now, the problem is a Christian will, because of confirmation bias, will say, actually, the evidence is worth a hell of a lot more. And really, you don't need much faith that the resurrection actually happened. So this then becomes a psychological thing where it's how much value do you ascribe to any given amount of evidence. So I say that the gospel sources are very poor level evidence, whereas a Christian will say, no, they're not, they're good. And we have an argument over the relative value of these sources. And the Christian will always come out saying that actually those sources are better quality evidence than they really are. But faith is to me, and I know Christians don't like this, or theists don't like this, but faith is belief absent of evidence. And so if you're thinking of a glass and filling it up with stuff so that you know to allow you to believe in something, then you know, if you've only got a tiny, like the moon is made of cheese, that's going to be a lot of faith there, with only the slightest bit of evidence that maybe last week I looked at the moon, it looked a little bit like cheese. It's like, well, whatever.
Well, Wallace and Gromit would probably appreciate that.
Yeah, nice reference. Like it. Good man.
So
yeah.
No, I was going to say, do you want to take us into the 4 newspaper accounts, how that works?
Well, yeah. So, I mean, you get an N.T. Wright, and people say that actually there are differences between the gospel accounts, and I'd say that these are either outright contradictions, or they're at the very least problematic differences. And someone like N.T. Wright would say, just like you get 4 different newspaper accounts for the same event that might be focusing on different things, that might have slight discrepancies or whatever, or apparent discrepancies, but they aren't really, blah, blah, blah. These are just 4 different newspaper accounts. And I'm like, no, I don't really buy that, especially since John is right out. You know, so John is making very different theological claims to the synoptic gospels. So the Matthew, Mark, and Luke are known as the synoptic gospels, and they broadly agree with each other because they generally are agreed to be using the same sources, either Mark or this Q's, this unknown source that some people believe exists, some people don't, and then Matthew and Luke to different degrees are using them, possibly each other. I don't know. There are loads of different theories, which I do talk a little bit about in the book. But you do get differences, and some of these differences are big. And at the end of the day, if you're talking about whether you see angels, like after when you go and visit an empty tomb, you know, it's a pretty big thing. And when those witnesses can only be certain people, it's like, how do we get this divergence of these claims that are made? But it's not just things like that. It's literally every single claim. So what I do in the book is I go through the whole Easter story, and I don't go to town on this either, because actually, you know, you look at Michael Alter's book, it's 1,000 pages of doing exactly that. And I didn't want this to be 1,000 pages, but you can look at every single verse that is written of the gospel of the resurrection and the Easter story, and you can challenge every single claim. The claims between the gospels, but the claims in isolation, in what we know about X, Y, and Z. Every claim is problematic. And actually, a large part of the book, I do that and make summaries of some of the problematic, you know, contradictions and positions that each gospel take. And then, as I say, you know, John's got quite a different theology. I mean, one thing I look at in there is that John sees Jesus literally as a Paschal lamb. So he hasn't been crucified on a different day because he needs to die. He needs to be the Paschal lamb, which is a Passover meal that the Jews have as a customary ritual. So Jesus becomes the Paschal lamb, which is why only in John do we have talk of not having his legs broken, which is a usual way of people having their deaths hastened on a crucifix, because they need to be taken down by sundown. Blah, 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 blah. So John has this scenario where Jesus is the Paschal lamb. The other 3 don't, and have him crucified on a different day. Could this just be different newspaper accounts, or is this a theological agenda of the writers coming to the fore? Yes, it is. So John, who's much more refined in his theology, has developed these overlays to what's come before and said, actually, no, I'm presenting Jesus as the Paschal lamb, and this is a sacrifice that is replacing the need for Christians to do what the Jews used to do, and this is the new Passover meal. And then
he's the new spotless lamb slain from the foundation of the world.
Yeah, which reminds me, I just wanted to say something you said earlier about how you can't see the ridiculousness of your own religion. I only kind of realized this maybe 10 years ago, that actually the bonkersness of the transubstantiation, of eating the actual blood and body of Christ, like the cannibalism kind of involved in that. The atheists often attack of Christians, but actually it's true. It's like Christians would laugh at other religions if they had those claims. You know, if what, every Sunday you go get on your knees and eat the actual body and drink the actual blood of your God figure. That's nuts. And yet it's so normalized that it's like, no, that's obviously what we do. Christians will say. Anyway, that was
that's exactly it's, and a lot of this stuff. I love how you're kind of dealing with the facts more strictly around the resurrection, but you're also just bringing in the human psychological aspect that we keep talking about. Like this, at the end of the day, no matter what we can pull apart and figure out about the resurrection and the canon and the other, church history, what they thought about it, at the end of the day, we're all scared, like you said, the terror aspect. We're scared of what happens after we die. And for a lot of people, just having that hope is so critical. Like, especially, I mean, this is my opinion, but if you've had a hard life, or you're like, you know what, I've had financial issues, I've had medical issues. I want to have some sense that it's going to get better. And for, especially our mortality is really prevalent now with COVID. Like, we're all very fearful and we don't know, but we know that even if we were super healthy and there was no COVID, we can get in the car and, be dead in 10 minutes. A lot of things could happen, and that mortality is so frightening. And for a lot of people, this topic is, it's almost like you have to emotionally brace yourself for it. If you're not already, a skeptic, you're not looking at it from a rational perspective, you really have to be willing to say, I'm willing to pursue the truth, no matter what it means for my pre-existing faith and worldview.
God is a function, a psychological function for people. And if you want to disabuse people of the notion of God existing, then actually you need to understand why they believe it. It's not about the content, it's about why they believe it. And then you need to replace that why with something else. So if you're saying that God provides a function of an afterlife, of like giving you comfort in your life now and giving you hope because you will live eternally in heaven, and I'm going to say, actually, you're not going to get that, then what do I do about that? And how do I compete with atheism? Like, you could on the one hand say, well, you can't compete. Okay, well, how do we make that? How do we couch it in a way that's really positive and that gives you, well, what can humanism bring something to this? Which is, okay, we might not live forever, so it's about finding meaning and hope in this life we have and working together and blah blah blah. So it's understanding what God does for you, in order to say, because that doesn't exist, we need to fill those gaps with something. It's why the book of poetry that I edited, humanist and atheistic poetry, was called Filling the Void. You should say, well, when you take away, so poetry, some of these poems was really wonderful in attempting to fill that void. Once you take away the God from your life, you've got this God-shaped hole. That was functional. It was doing something. So what do we plug that with that allows you to live a fulfilled life going forward?
It's great reminders, and it's a good reminder too, I think, for us to be patient. I mean, I think there's some cynicism that we level against religion that is very valid, and sometimes, even if we're just going to be like Jesus was very cynical, supposedly, to the Pharisees, and call them whitewashed tombs. So even if we were just going to be like Jesus, we'd be cynical. But when we say something like, look, Mr. Christian, I have a problem with genital mutilation, and your book espouses it, but leaps and bounds. I have a problem with genocide and land theft and slavery. Your book espouses it by leaps and bounds. I have a problem with blood magic and scapegoating. We think we're trying to engage them on these issues and say, this doesn't make sense to me. Can you please explain to me how this can possibly make any sense to you? And what we're doing, like you said, is we think we're dealing with these issues. What they're interpreting as is, you're telling me there's no afterlife, and you're attacking my stability. It's invisible. It doesn't sound like it's the issue, but it actually kind of is. The issue to them is not.
Even if it's not the afterlife, it's like, and also it's the church that I go to on a weekly basis, and my family unit and my social networks. So it's like you're not only taking away my afterlife, but you're literally taking away all of the social things, the social functions that God provides.
Yeah. And you're implying that for whatever time you've put into this, you basically lived as in a delusion. And
Yeah.
horrors if you passed it on. But anyway, I don't want to take up our time too much for my
Yeah.
questions. Feel free to take us to the next section here.
Well, I was just going to say, I'll skip over the 75% of New Testament scholars. Well, I know, I'll very quickly say it. This is something that people like William Lane Craig says, which is the empty tomb is true because 75% of scholars, New Testament scholars, believe it's true. And I'm like, well, 99% of Islamic scholars believe in the truth of the Quran. Doesn't mean it's true.
Yeah.
So broadly, I mean, I'd go into a lot more detail than that, but broadly, it's a nonsense claim. Go away.
I would imagine 100% of Mormons think that Joseph Smith really pulled those gold plates out of the ground.
And actually, 75% is pretty low, I would argue. I would argue that there's probably a lot of New Testament scholars there that are, yeah.
Plus, it's changing. Like, I think from what I've heard, a generation or two ago, people used to say Moses was probably real, and now they're shifting that and saying no, he probably wasn't.
Yeah.
Like, how can you can't base it on the party line.
So one project I've got that in the future, I've written a bunch of articles on my blog debunking the Exodus, and it will be a book that's similar to this and the Nativity book, which is looking at the Exodus, but that's something in the future.
Nice.
So then I look at the Matthew 28 claims of the earthquakes and the saints, the zombies parading around Jerusalem, because that's what they are, dead saints getting up, walking around that apparently everyone in Jerusalem saw, and the veil of the temple veil being rent in Jerusalem as well, and darkness and whatnot. So saying, right, okay, if this really happens, you would expect to see lots of amazing evidence for this, because this is massive in terms of Jewish history and culture. This is huge, and you hear nothing, literally nothing. There's only in a couple of the Gospels do you get a couple of the claims, and not even all of the claims have all. So Matthew has the lot, and then some of the others have a couple of them. Matthew's the only one that has zombies parading around, and he clearly says that everyone saw. So we get onto this idea of absence of evidence is not evidence of absence, that you hear Christians say quite a lot, which is what that means is that if you don't see it, if there is no evidence for it, it doesn't mean it didn't happen. So it's going to say that maybe I don't know, there was something, I don't know, maybe there's I can't even think of anything that would do justice to this, because I don't really think it works very often. But you can, I don't know, maybe next door was broken into yesterday. I'm looking at a house and I'm saying, and she's on holiday. I'm looking at a house and saying, well, I can't see any evidence for it. There's no broken windows, there's no broken doors. That doesn't mean it wasn't broken into. And I agree with that, actually. But fair enough. Maybe they jimmied open a window and then left it exactly right. So there is no evidence it's been broken into, but it was broken into. That's fair enough. In that sense, absence of evidence does not mean it didn't happen. Okay, and I agree with that. However, when you would expect there to be evidence and evidence isn't there, we have a problem. So, for example, if I said to you, do you know yesterday in your hometown, Tim, there was an earthquake that was 7.5 on the Richter scale? And you say, that's weird. I didn't feel it. It's not been on the news. There's no reports of it. I've driven around my local town. That all the buildings there's literally no evidence of a 7.5 earthquake. Then you would have every right to come back to me to say, I don't believe that, because there is absolutely no evidence of it. In this case, evidence of absence absence of evidence is evidence of absence. When you would expect there to be evidence and there isn't evidence, then that works towards the conclusion that something didn't happen.
And to some level, there's got to be something. I mean, like to piggyback off your theft example, like if you don't see the evidence, there's no evidence up front, but eventually the police are going to investigate. If they go in and they're like, well, there's a whole bunch of gold jewelry which the thief would have taken, and it's sitting right there, it's not touched. There's a $3,000 computer, not touched. There's artwork here and no one touched it. It looks like we've dusted for fingerprints. There's no fingerprints except for the homeowners. At some point, you got to say something's up here.
It's a really good point.
If you're sure there's a theft, give us something.
There would eventually be some evidence, of course. Yeah, it's a really good point. It gets slightly different in history when the ability to do that conduct that kind of investigation it becomes impossible. Right. So this is what Christians would go to is, just because there's no evidence doesn't mean it didn't happen. Well, actually, I'm sorry, but if you have parades of zombie saints in Jerusalem and not a single source outside of the Gospel of Matthew mentions this. It didn't happen. I'm sorry. I don't believe it. I simply don't believe it. It didn't happen.
Yeah.
Whatever.
Can I ask you, did you happen to see the show The Walking Dead at all?
Yeah.
Whenever this topic comes up, I can't help but think about one of them just, getting their crossbow or their gun or something, be like, I got this. I'll take care of this.
Yeah. No, they're saints. They were like properly nice people. Oh no, he shot them all. Yeah, brilliant. Yeah, so I think that's really important, and it's really important in terms of looking at Paul. So Paul is our earliest source of the resurrection, and he has virtually nothing on the resurrection. None of the claims of the empty tomb, none of the claims other than Jesus resurrected. Jesus was crucified and resurrected, right? Basically, and that's it. And so, what does this tell us? If Paul, our earliest and arguably most reliable source, therefore, that has no claims about these things, are they later embellishments? Does it look like, as I would say, that with each successive gospel we have an embellishment of what happens? Yes, it does look like that. And actually, it starts with Paul giving us virtually nothing, where we would expect him to. So he's having these arguments with the Corinthians, for example, and that's a great place to shove in a couple of the claims of the empty tomb, about the resurrection, about this and that, and it's not there. So again, that absence of evidence is problematic. So I look at that. I look at Paul's claims.
Can I ask you? Can I dig into Paul for a second? With the theories about where the Jesus character even came from, where his source from, the whole idea that he may have been, just theoretically, it's still up for debate, I think, but he may have been based on angelology and the ancient cosmology, that this was stuff that was happening up in the heavens. There were cosmic fights. Paul talks about that Christ was crucified by the archons of this age. We don't fight against flesh and blood, but against principalities and powers. What would that mean if that were true? And I'm not saying you believe or don't believe that theory, but if it were true that the Christ story started as part of this, heavenly cosmology, that there's wars in heaven that are we can't see, but they're in that sense they're more real than our reality. They're more important and impacting, and what they're doing up in the heavens is reflected in how we eventually earn our salvation and have a relationship with God. What would it have meant, do you think, for a heavenly crucifixion to have had, I guess, a heavenly resurrection? Do you know what I mean by that? Like if Christ wasn't actually crucified by the Romans in history, but that was just a metaphor for the crucifixion that occurred with the archons up in the heavens, what would an actual space resurrection mean?
I'm inclined to the belief that Jesus did exist as an itinerant preacher. So I'm not a mythicist, but I won't die on that hill, whatever. Because I think let me just clarify my position. So I'm effectively a mythicist in the fact that I believe there is a nugget, a kernel of truth to the Gospels intuitively, that Jesus existed as someone from Nazareth and was crucified. And I think that's in Jerusalem. And I think that's basically all you can know. That's Jesus, right? And everything else in the Gospels is legendary embellishment, right? And therefore, it's effectively mythological, because really, it doesn't look that much different from Jesus not existing at all. There's just a couple of claims. So then you say, right, okay, my opinion would be, and again, it's fairly intuitive, but this is a really reasonable and I think much more probable account for the data, which is that he was an itinerant preacher that generated quite a following. He ended up getting killed, crucified, and they weren't expecting that. They're expecting a kind of old school Messiah type, Jewish Messiah. He didn't end up fulfilling the criteria of the Messiah. And so there was a hell of a lot of cognitive dissonance. So he died. He possibly was, and I talk about this later in the book, he possibly was put temporarily somewhere and then moved, and then his followers thought he was in that first place and went there, and he wasn't there. And he was actually moved to a criminal's graveyard, or he was buried straight away in a criminal's graveyard, and these embellishments came out of that. right? But you have this guy who died, and then everyone else having cognitive dissonance, going, "Oh my God, I thought this was going to be the Messiah, and he wasn't." Blah blah blah, and then maybe a couple of people having hallucinations, and then out of this kind of disappointment, they then go back and say, "How do we understand?" Either we walk away and say this is all a load of rubbish, but that generally doesn't happen with human psychology. They say, "Okay, this happened. He died, but he still has to be the Messiah. How can we harmonize those two things?" This is how cognitive dissonance works. So it's like, okay, let's go back into the Old Testament and look for Messiah type figures who die. So let's look at sacrifice. Let's look at all these things. And then they go through and they find quotes here and quotes there in the Old Testament, and they apply that to Jesus. And they weren't prophecies, but they use them as prophecies, and they say, okay, and they start building up this understanding of who Jesus was. And I don't even think they thought Jesus was God at that stage. I thought that they genuinely, the early followers, thought he was a Messiah figure, but not the kind of Trinity figure that was later developed. And that embellishes through the Gospels as we get even Joseph of Arimathea becomes more embellished. All these ideas become more and more embellished until you get to John, and then a whole new theology is developed, and that continues and continues.
And like you said, there was a lot of these guys running around, the messianic apocalyptic guys in that time.
Yeah, Simon Barth.
I mean, there's still some. Yeah. Do you, if I'm jumping ahead here, we can put this on the side, but do you deal at all with the issue of the Josephus story where he I know a chunk of the Gospels is based on Josephus, but where Josephus tells in his stories that he goes by these three criminals that are crucified, and he's asked for them to be taken down, and two of them do die, but one of them ends up surviving.
Right, so that is not to do with Christianity at all. I thought you were going to talk about his mentions of Christianity in the Interpolations, the well-known Interpolations, Testimonium Flavianum, and stuff like that. But no, this is interesting. I do talk about his claims there because it's prevalent. It's relevant for how we understand Jewish customs to do with crucifixion and burial, and that people could survive. Because you get things like the swoon theory, which is that some people believe that Jesus didn't actually die, went unconscious, was taken down because they thought he was died, took him down to bury him, and perhaps he was like, oh, do you know what, I'm all right now, or whatever, and then regained consciousness, or his followers came and got him and he was still alive. So there are things like the swoon theory which would fit with that data. I think that's fairly improbable. But again, I think it's more probable than the dying and rising God-man spirit figure.
But I mean, you don't think that it's just purely a copy of that story, then, is that?
Oh, no, probably not.
Okay.
But that's merely intuition. I think, I think that there's good evidence to suggest Luke and Josephus were pretty close in some of what they were writing, but it all gets a bit technical thereafter.
It's all conjecture at that point.
But I think the general point for me is that you probably did have a dying cult leader, and it's what his followers did with that disappointment that generated and when you talk about it psychologically speaking, when you talk about elements of grief and anger and guilt, we know that those things are more likely to trigger hallucinations and experiences. And when you talk about, even in conservative estimates, 13% of people hallucinate after someone dies, and then you talk, well, there's some cultures where it's more prevalent, that's 40-50%, and you're thinking, well, back in the times of Jesus, it's almost certain that at least one of his followers would have had hallucinations, almost certain.
Yeah, and it's the whole idea that the messianic part of this, I think a lot of us who are not from a really strong either Jewish background or that we've really dove into it, I think it's hard for us to understand just what that can do in terms of, like, you just have to believe. Like, I was interviewing a guy a while ago who had left the Chabad Lubavitch Jewish culture, which is
right, which I talk about in the book quite a lot. Yeah,
and but they believe that Rebbe, they're like, there's number one, they couldn't believe that he died, and then when he died, there was, I guess, supposed to like pick a new one, but they couldn't pick a new one because like he was he was the Rebbe. He's going to come
Yeah.
back to life. And as far as I know, I should do a little more digging to be sure, but I think they're still without a Rebbe, because they're like, we know who the Rebbe is, and he's going to come. He did die, yes, but he's coming back. So what's the point of picking a different one? And the power of believing that the resurrection just has to happen. It has to happen.
So that in the section on I think it's the maybe the naturalistic theories, what I think happened, or in the post-resurrection appearances section, I talk about that sect of that Jewish sect, because the death of their supposed Messiah had huge impacts, and experiences of the followers was really really tells you a lot about what would have gone on in the early Christian church. Wasn't even a church, I suppose, then, with Jesus's followers. And I think there's a lot you can learn from these. There's another character called Sabbatai Savi, who was a Jewish leader, Messiah figure, who eventually became an apostate and converted to Islam. And then the cognitive dissonance of his followers, and suddenly there were all these miracle claims and blah blah blah, and it's like, oh my goodness, this fits the mold. You see the Jesus claims and the Jesus story, it just fits the mold with these other figures as well, and there's naturalistic explanations. There are naturalistic explanations for what happened. They are far more probable.
And it's amazing, there's the dynamic of someone saying, I don't care what the evidence says, I will never stop believing in X. You can't. Remember that Ken Ham debate where they were talking about, what would it take for you to change your position? And Bill Nye was like, evidence. Yeah. And Ken Ham's answer was something on the lines of, I wouldn't. I already know the truth. Like,
ain't gonna happen. Yeah.
What's the point of your question? We already know the truth.
Which then makes you start going, well, what's the point of debating, with someone like that? And that's a problem. And it goes back to psychology. But when you're talking in terms of the resurrection, you understand that psychology is hugely important in understanding, for trying to unpick what the followers of Jesus would have gone through at the time, and what they would have been suggesting had happened, and how Christianity came to be. And it's all closely linked to psychology: disappointment, grief, anger and guilt, and all these things. And then the theology that they had at the time.
And I'll just add one more item to that: the book of Enoch, which is quoted endlessly in the New Testament. If you read that and you understand that how much of the book of Enoch had to do with the perspective of Jews at that time, they were sure that there were angelic armies that were going to come back and make things right. They were going to restore the kingdom. And so just the idea that it wasn't just even this little thing of like, well, Jesus has to be it. It's like they just knew that there was all kinds of movements of God and the angels, the fighting. It was all going on around them, and they were so specific. They were naming the different archangels and the enemies. They were naming the people that had all the power. The principalities and powers. There weren't just like generic groups. Like people could list off who they were. They had this whole perspective going on, and so you couldn't just nitpick one thing. They knew that the whole thing was real. It was an entire worldview. And it's amazing to me that like when you look at the book of Enoch and the extension of Isaiah as well, when you look at what these people really believed, that there were angels ready, just waiting for the people of God to do the right thing, to be a pure people. At that moment, the angels would come back, and we would basically fight with the angels to restore the kingdom. Being wrapped up that in a radicalized sense, I think it's really hard for us to understand just what that would do to your ability to believe certain things. If you just knew that that's what every ounce of your existence is about, is this radical fight that's about to happen, that's going to bring the invisible forces into the visible, this cosmological, universal scale war that's going on that we can't see but is happening all the time. It's about to get really real in our physical senses. We're about to see it happen. You get people that live and breathe and eat and drink on that level. There's all kinds of stuff going on there.
This is why it's important to know with the gospel writers who their audience were, and who the gospel writers were. So what theology did they have? What are they trying to bring to what they're writing, and how are they trying to evangelize to their audience? So the audience are Jews. How are they using the Old Testament to appeal to their Jewish audience? If, like Luke, they're more likely to be Gentiles, how are they maybe distancing themselves or using other things, techniques, mechanisms to appeal to a Gentile audience, and so on and so forth. So yeah, it's really super important. I mean, we're probably running out of time, but considering we've only got halfway through the book in terms of what my case was, but yeah. I mean, you start looking at the events leading up to the crucifixion. This is why I look at things like the Last Supper, the capture and the trial, because the trial never happened, because the claims about the trial in the Gospels are thoroughly problematic, and it wouldn't have happened like it did, like it was claimed. So that wouldn't have happened.
Could I ask what you mean because of like Jewish laws?
Yeah, Jewish laws at the time, very much like the same with the crucifixion. How would Jesus have been executed? Well, we know that for what he supposedly did, blasphemy and high treason, he almost certainly would have been stoned, maybe hung on a cross after he was stoned for kind of purposes of deterrence, and then pulled down at sunset, which I do believe would have happened, and so on and so forth. So but the same with the claims of the trial, they wouldn't have been able to call these people. This was supposedly Sabbath and Passover and all this kind of stuff, and this trial apparently happened in a way that's claimed in the Gospels. Absolutely didn't. But you've got the carrying of the cross, the thieves on the cross, Jesus' followers, the woman Jesus mocked, blood and water and wine, dividing up the clothes, casting lots, all these kind of these claims that happened that you're like, whatever. But when you start looking at the details of them, they are hugely problematic. And the next section I do is the prophecies. And the reason why half of these claims turn up, like they're bonkers, right? Jesus has just been scourged. So have you seen the Passion of Christ? Yeah. Right, maybe it's something like that. So he's absolutely scourged, and then he puts his clothes back on, and then carries his cross down to be crucified. And then the soldiers cast lots to see who gets his clothes, like these disgusting blood-covered like garments. Why would they do that? And it turns out that actually it's in a so-called prophecy, as are loads of these weird claims that you're thinking when you're reading the resurrection with a critical eye, you're going, why did that happen? Why is that in there? And you realize that there are these just little bits that they've nicked from the Old Testament and retold them in the Easter story. And then you think, when you suddenly see the connection between the two, you're like, that's why that's there. So that almost certainly didn't happen, because it's just there as a validation, because the Jewish audience would know, right, yeah, that's what happened. Right, there's a connection to the Old Testament. Yeah, brilliant. So Jesus is this awesome kind of Jewish Messiah, right? So on and so forth. And so the use of so-called prophecies to bolster the Easter story is really overt. In fact, John at one stage says, this happened so that it fulfilled the prophecies. I was like, oh, right. So you're not even trying to hide this. This is just theological overlay. This nonsense stuff that clearly wouldn't have happened is only in there in order to fulfill the prophecies. Right, okay, I get this. It's just theology. It's not history, it's just theology.
Yeah. Amazing. Can I ask, before we go to the next chapter, do you find, do you dive into it all in your own mind, just the Gnostic version of this, where, you look at the Marys, and it seems pretty clear they're based on the two Sophias. What are the odds? It's just going to be two Marys in this story, two Marys at the foot of the cross. They have the stories of the mother Sophia who's wise, and the other Sophia that's kind of learning and making mistakes. And exactly the characters that you have here. Like, how much of this do you see as just people trying to basically write a parable? Maybe to bring it into like the John Dominic Crossan world, but how much of this is a parable where it's not even like they actually saw a Mary, the mother of Jesus, and a Mary Magdalene, but if there was a guy and he was impaled or crucified, that they want to turn this into a story maybe of the journey of the soul or some other aspect of this. Like, how do you pull that apart?
I think the more you start looking at this, the more you realize the whole lot appears to be just some kind of theological project to invent a Jesus that wasn't that personal God. So possibly with what you're saying, there are, again, a bit like comparative mythology and, Robert Price, there are so many connections between different religions, but it's dangerous maybe to take them all on board and go, yeah, they're all true. They're all, you do have to do a bit of sifting, but it seems like pretty much all the claims of the Easter story don't have their place in history. I think what was written was theology. Yeah. I think you've got gospel writers that had their own theological agenda. Say, right, Jesus died. We started developing to develop this early church. We're starting to believe this, and this is how I'm going to write Jesus and what happened. And then that's embellished. So Mark does that, and then Matthew and Luke take that on a little bit. And then John goes, well, I've had some time to think about this. We've had some time as a Christian church to think about this. And this is my community's interpretation. This is my interpretation of what happened. And I'm going to change the theology slightly. And I'm having Jesus as more of a divine figure right from the beginning, the Logos and all that. And so, but I think all of them are doing theology and none of them are doing history. And I think that's really, really important. And I think the way that they go back into the Old Testament and just pick out bits and pieces and then write that into the story is just a really good example of how they're. So my mate that used to be a very conservative Christian is not so much anymore. That's an interesting story in itself. But he used to say that this was history scripturalized. So he used to say that the Gospels were history, but nicely scripturalized, given a nice scriptural veneer, but it's still historical at base. And I'd say no, it's scripture historicized. And I'd say actually the Gospels are taking scripture and then claiming it to be history. So they're historicizing the scripture, and it's really, really problematic to do that. But you start looking at things like the prophecies. I mean, I could talk forever about the prophecies, but we'll just skip on to Joseph of Arimathea, this supposed pious Jew who throughout the Gospels is embellished himself, becomes more and more of a pious Jew, and then when he himself is actually prophesied, so he is there are elements of who he is that are taken from the Old Testament. And then I really like Richard Carey's analysis of the language of Arimathea, which if you look at the Greek, it seems like it's saying best disciple town. Like no one's heard of Arimathea. It doesn't exist. There's no evidence of Arimathea, especially being a city. Literally, there's no evidence anywhere outside of the Gospels. So what does Joseph of Arimathea, what can we make of that then? Well, if the Greek analysis makes it look like best disciple, all the other disciples are scarpered. They're all angry, guilty, sad, whatever. They've all done a runner. Who's the person that picks Jesus' body off the cross and puts him supposedly in an empty tomb? Joseph of best disciple town, right? So, okay. So, and you'll find that the motif, and if you've probably read about this with MacDonald and others, but the reversal of expectation motif. So you get the idea that the disciples should be these amazing people, but they end up bungling loads of stuff. And you get this throughout the Gospels, this reversal of expectation where, and Thomas denies Jesus and all this kind of stuff. And you're like, okay, so it's a pious Sanhedrin member that ends up they've just sentenced him to death, and now it's this guy that goes and takes him off. Okay, this looks like a very theological approach, and the idea that there would be a rock-hewn tomb ready for him to be buried in when such a criminal would it would be a desecration of that site. He would have been taken down and put in a criminal's, probably a sort of some kind of crypt of many holes where you put. Because what happened is, after a year of being, once all their flesh is rotted away, criminals, their families could come. This is written very clearly in Jewish law. The family can come back and claim the body and do a second burial of the bones, right? But they need to be completely decayed away. But you get all these criminals that would obviously be happening quite in a big city like Jerusalem, happening quite a lot. So it would have been a big sort of criminals graveyard, probably rather than a shallow grave that there might be in other towns. I don't think Jerusalem would have had a shallow grave. It would be too difficult for that. People like Crossan think that Jesus would have been left on a cross and eaten by wild animals and then buried in a shallow grave. I don't think that's the most likely occurrence, but it would have been taken down before sunset. He's had a really quick death, it seems, taken down and then buried in this some kind of crypt. And then no one would really know where he was buried. I mean, he wouldn't. The empty tomb story seems to be a complete embellishment. Like, Paul didn't know about it. The claims don't really make a lot of sense. And what you're doing is saying Jesus, who was given a dishonorable death because high treason and blasphemy is the worst, suddenly gets an honorable burial, and Pontius Pilate says, yeah, that's fine, take him to, that's all right, you can have him, put him in a nice tomb. And the Sanhedrin appear to be having not a problem. They've just gone to having an illegal trial, a rush through trial, that even if you accept that actually happened on the Sabbath and blah blah blah, they're saying, yeah, let's kill him, he's horrible, blah blah blah, and then suddenly going, yeah, it's fine, yeah, no worries, yeah, you can take him down and put him in a nice tomb, that's not a problem. It's like, what's going on here? So I look at that.
Yeah, agreed. It doesn't, it just, the whole thing just keeps on falling apart on them. It's interesting too how, you know, the birth story starts with a Mary and a Joseph, and like they have to have a Mary and a Joseph at the end of his life too.
Yeah.
It's like a bookend.
Yeah, of course. Yeah. Do you know what? I've never thought of that, but maybe, who knows? Yeah. So you know, I have a massive section in the book is on the burial practices, because this is huge. Like the empty tomb, I don't think happened. I don't think Paul knew anything about the empty tomb. This is a later embellishment. And it's what people like William Lane Craig put a lot of store in. So he says the empty tomb definitely happened, and here's why it happened, blah, blah, blah. And it happened because we need that for the belief in the resurrection, because it's integral to the later claims about what happened with the first people who visited the empty tomb. It was empty and blah, blah, blah. But I think the whole thing didn't happen. You know, the empty tomb is thoroughly problematic. So I go through an awful lot on the empty tomb. And you mentioned Gnostics. It's interesting. Gnostics now, Jesus Seminar have rejected it as a term. So there's this belief that the Gnostics were a whole group of people believing certain things. I think the most current understanding is that Gnostics really now refer to just a set of disparate beliefs that different cults of Christianity had, but you didn't have one Gnostic cult that believed all these things, and they were the Gnostics. I think now that's generally rejected, and there's this belief that, and I mentioned this in the books very quickly, that there were certain Gnostic beliefs, and different sects will have had different beliefs, and one of them was the belief in the type of resurrection, the spiritual resurrection rather than the bodily resurrection. And they do a whole section on this, because this is super important as well, is that you look at each subsequent gospel seems to opt for a bodily resurrection more and more, so much so that John has doubting Thomas poking Jesus in the body, and Jesus eating broiled fish and all this kind of stuff, which is like basically just saying Jesus was a human body walking around, or a divine human body walking around. Whereas I don't think Paul thought that. I think, and I agree with Richard Carrier's analysis, that Paul believed in a two-body spiritual resurrection, whereas Jesus' body stayed as a human body there and then resurrected in another spiritual body. And I think Paul is quite clear on that, which is why he argued with the Corinthians about it. And then the subsequent gospel authors, to more and more robustness, disagree with this and say, no, it was a bodily resurrection, and that body got up, and that's how we have the empty tomb, and that proves Jesus's resurrection. I don't think Paul believed that.
Can I ask about the Gospels part of this? Could you, I know some of this, but I'd like to hear from you, but the ending of Mark, what's going on there with how that's working? And just, can you give us the background for anyone that doesn't know about that?
Well, so the post-resurrection appearances and basically the ending of Mark is in brackets in most Bibles, because it's an interpolation, and that's pretty much everyone agrees with that.
Interpolation meaning somebody added it later on. Yeah,
so it was added later on, and so it's very hard to make certain claims about really what happened. It's interesting because actually Mark should be one of our earliest sources, and since we don't see it in Paul, it would be interesting to see a bunch of these claims in Mark, but then those claims about, say, the empty tomb, the resurrection appearances, are interpolations. So what conclusions can we draw from that? Well, none really. So we then have to go to Matthew and Luke And already we've seen embellishments. So
But I
then
mean, the
you
fact
start.
that they didn't even have it, does that tell you anything?
Well, I think. Well, absence of evidence, blah blah blah. So the argument, it depends what you want to believe, I suppose. So the Christians will say, well, actually, there's still good reason to believe X, Y, and Z, and the atheists like myself will say, oh, this basically lends itself towards the empty tomb and the resurrection accounts being later embellishments, because you definitely would have seen them in Paul in some way, I'm sure. And we don't have them in the earliest manuscripts of Mark, and they only start popping up later and later. And so we're fairly sure they didn't exist at all, in Mark. But there are different theories on the Mark and interpolations and whatnot.
It really, just this a side note, it really makes you wonder, like, why Christians don't get bothered more with canonicity and just what's in it. Like, I remember reading about someone talking about, the Marcionite gospel appears to have not had the first few chapters of Luke in it. And people say, well, he probably took them out. Well, maybe he didn't have them, and maybe there was a version of Luke that didn't have the first few chapters, and they got added later. Like, just the whole, it's a big bottle of question marks. But what if a whole bunch of this stuff wasn't there at the beginning?
That's fascinating.
And they just added so much.
Totally agree with that, and I've written an article or two on that. I think the Marcionite gospel, I think the nativity accounts were definitely interpolated later. The question is, so even Raymond Brown believes this, a great Catholic scholar, biblical exegete, but he would say that it was Luke that added it later himself as a kind of afterthought. And then you might be asking, well, why did Luke feel the need to add it later? And then other people still say, no, doing a lexical analysis, the language is different and it's not Luke. And so it depends what you believe, but I think that's an interpolation. Hector Avalos, the late great Hector Avalos, wrote the End of Biblical Studies, which is a really good book that looks into this kind of area and interpolations and the reliability of the Gospels as sources for these reasons. And
we're not even touching on the much maybe bigger elephant in the room, which is that there's a lot more gospels. We're sticking to the four and to Acts, but
if you're talking about Joseph of Arimathea, or you're talking about later embellishments, so what happens is you get these four gospels and then even more embellished gospels going on. So Joseph of Arimathea ends up going to England, to Glastonbury, and having it's ridiculous. So what happened is they cut off the four. Maybe it's because there are four winds or whatever, but it's as if to say,
of the earth.
These four gospels are we're going to draw the line here because these are fairly reasonable, right? These ones are bonkers, and it's this arbitrary line to say, hang on, these are bonkers too. It's like you're drawing this arbitrary line of these guys are well out, but these guys are fine. It's like, no, these are bonkers too.
And they even argued, but even that like that this is bonkers, this is okay. That argument didn't really stop for a while, because from what I understand, the book of Revelation was out for a while. I think Hebrews might have been on the chopping block. James was certainly on the chopping block. Jude, I think, and Second Peter, with they're quoting Enoch. Because Enoch fell out of favor. It was like totally in favor at the beginning, and then it fell out of favor. So they're like, we don't know about the Enoch references. Like, some of these books were, I think Revelation took hundreds of years to be included.
You got, Paul's letters, 7 of the 13 are authentic. So you got 6 that aren't, it's all, again, it goes back to the question of, are these, exceptionally good quality evidence?
Yeah.
No,
so
they're not.
It's almost like you have to add a caveat, like the resurrection that we're talking about is the resurrection version of a very specific canon that was solidified over a huge amount of time, and that there may have theoretically been other resurrection accounts. We're dealing with the one that's kind of evolved to come down to us.
Yeah, which was evolved from 4 and 5, if you include Paul, different stories that you have to bend quite a bit to form one coherent narrative, a bit like the nativity stories of Luke and Matthew are completely incoherent, and in order to thread them together, you can't do it, but Christians do it. And in the same way, if they can do that, then they can thread together the four like contradictory gospels that may be contradictory in slightly different ways, and maybe not as fundamental as, say, Luke and Matthew in the nativity, but they're still thoroughly problematic and lead you to believe that these just aren't reliable sources, because every verse has got a problem.
Yeah.
And we've only touched on some of these. I could have spent a whole 2 hours talking about Joseph of Arimathea, for God's sake.
Yeah.
And we've got Matthew's guards at the tombs that only appear in Matthew, but they seem to be a reaction to early Jewish criticisms of the resurrection claims. But they don't appear in any of the Gospels. You've got the woman at the tomb. They're thoroughly problematic as well. The empty tomb in and of itself, and stuff I was touched on earlier about the two-body resurrection, is huge, because I think fundamentally the Gospels disagree with the earlier source, Paul, on really how the resurrection worked. And then you've got the appearances and the problems of the different appearances. It just gets worse and worse and worse. And then at the end.
Can I dig into that one? The 500, yeah. I'm sure you've heard it. There were 500 witnesses to this thing. What do you do with that? I mean, there's. I've heard different examples, but how do you see it?
I see it as one of two things. Well, first of all, if you literally think 500 people saw this, then that's absence of evidence problem. You would expect there to be other evidence of this, because that's phenomenal, right? You've got 500 people have seen God in the flesh, resurrected. That's a problem. And it kind of almost goes back to the Matthew's guards at the tombs. Sorry, I had said I wouldn't really talk about it, but you had these guards that were paid by the Sanhedrin to stand outside the tomb to make sure that no one came and nicked the body, which means to say that already at this time, Jews believed that the body was nicked. So the Christians had to invent a refutation of this. So Matthew did that by inventing the guards at the tomb. So he said, it couldn't have been stolen. There were guards at the tomb. But they run back, and Matthew has them running back to the Sanhedrin saying, we saw it, blah, blah, blah. And they bribe them to keep quiet. These two people have just seen God resurrected, right? And they're like, run back and say, they don't believe. It's just like the Exodus account of all the Egyptians seeing all these crazy stuff, and none of them believing in Yahweh. You've got the 10 plagues, you've got them chasing and losing an entire army in the Red Sea or the Sea of Reeds or whatever, and like none of them think, maybe we're supporting the wrong God. None of them go like,
let's make a golden calf.
I think we've got the wrong God. Like none of them. And Egypt continues being pagan, right? And it's like Matthew's guards run along and say, we've just seen God. And they go, here's a couple of shekels, keep quiet. Oh yeah, no worries. And then they run off. And then you've got these 500 people seeing God, and they're like, never heard from him again. Or as Richard Carrier would say, this is a bastardization of the word for Pentecost. And actually this was the 500 is actually the Pentecost thing. So there are different theories about what the 500 could be, but we get back to absence of evidence is evidence of absence.
Yeah, and I feel like I'm leaning, and I don't want to derail us with my thoughts here too much, but I feel like I'm leaning pretty heavily in what I understand so far is that the Jesus character was not, in my mind, based on one guy, but he was, maybe somebody had an original guy in mind, even though there was a lot of people named Jesus. It was a common name then, but just that he was most likely to me an amalgamation of many different characters. And so you see, for example, King Basius, it looks like Paul was using the story of King Basius to kind of like take over the identity of Jesus, the brother of James. And then you have King Basius going to Israel to become the king, and he has a cavalry of 500 people. And it's like, the more that I look into this, I just wonder, it feels like you really have to have a scope for the imagination to think there were so many historical and different things going on, and some of them I'm not sure, it could be, it might not be, but just the idea that we know that this was literal history is so questionable to me.
Yeah, I think numbers are a problem. In numerology is an interesting area of the Bible as a whole. It rained for 40 days and 40 nights. The Israelites were wandering around a desert for 40 years without being able to wander themselves out of it. It's like, 40 is probably not your accurate number there. 12, 40, 12, 40, 500. So, I don't know the prevalence of 500 as much as say 40 and 12. But certainly numbers, you see them popping up, and it's like, I'm not sure I trust any kind of use of numbers really.
Yeah. And plus the idea of like, why, if there's really 500 witnesses, tell us, like, who are they? Like, you can go to this town and you can talk to this person. number one, are all these 500 already dead? Has that been a generation removed? So are you saying there were 500 people, they're all deceased because they, your life expectancy back then was much shorter? Are they all gone, or can I go talk to them? Okay, well, give me some names. Who are they? And just being able to pull that card out and say there were 500 people, it sounds real impressive at first. I got this crowd of people that can testify to it, but there's nothing more given. Like, okay, so who?
Well,
Well, there's 500. Well, who?
This is where it becomes very fortuitous that the fall of Jerusalem in 70 CE, like suddenly all the records have disappeared, and it's a great time to write about what happened to Jesus, because you're like, yeah, no one could go to Jerusalem anymore. Like, for differing periods, Jews weren't allowed in, or they were, or they couldn't do this, or whatever. But all the records were destroyed and buildings were destroyed. So you can write anything. It's like, yeah, I'm going to write this about Jesus, and do you know what? People won't be able to verify it.
Yeah.
You can't check that Joseph of Arimathea was on the Sanhedrin, because you can't check the Sanhedrin records, because we all know they were destroyed. So this gives you free reign to pretty much make up your own theology and write it into history, and no one could do anything about it. So yeah, I go on to talk about the post-resurrection appearances, and then talk a lot about the psychology, because at the end of the day, I used to think that actually visions were a bit of a cop-out for explaining naturalistically what happened, but actually having looked into it, I'm like, oh wow, right, these happen an awful lot. This is really prevalent anthropologically across the world. I use a lot of work by Humayun Sidki, who's written as an anthropologist, who's written a lot about this. In fact, he's endorsed my book as well, which is great. It's interesting, and I've had experiences myself where, in hindsight, I thought, oh, actually, I've had sleep paralysis, where I've seen a couple of visions of weird things, of really terrifying things, through sleep paralysis, and where you think, oh, I've never experienced anything like this, and blah blah blah, it's all a load of rubbish. Actually, people do experience things, and this is very normal, and we shouldn't just dismiss some of these naturalistic theories just because it almost belittles, because what you're doing is you're taking the whole divine narrative and structure, and you're in some sense belittling it to hallucinations and naturalistic things, and people have a problem with going from there to there, I think, and therefore things like visions get dismissed. Actually, no, we've got a shed load of evidence to support this happening in every culture in the world forever, right? And so I think to dismiss visions is a dangerous thing to do. And it's something I used to do a little bit, but now I give it so much more credibility because there's just a ton of evidence to support it.
Do you think any of that was from psychedelics?
Revelations might be.
Yeah, I mean, like Paul seeing stuff and going up to the third heaven.
So there are theories about him, temporal lobe epilepsy and stuff like that. Although I was speaking to someone recently, and actually it doesn't look like Paul. I think there's a paper coming out soon about how it almost certainly wasn't the case with Paul. But who knows? Who knows? When anything naturalistic just has a much greater probability, and it sounds, Christians will say that's a cop out, but it's just true. It's like, why would you go straight to like the most improbable interpretation of this, which would require the highest degree of evidence, and you're being sold this not on the highest degree of evidence. You're being sold it because your family believe it, and your family's family believed it, and your family's families believed it, and where you're from generally believes it. And had you been born in Riyadh, mate, you wouldn't believe this. So like, this has nothing to do with the quality of evidence. You didn't believe this after studying the quality of evidence of the Gospels. You came to believe, think about yourself, Tim, you came to believe your Christianity not after going, hang on, before you tell me anything about the theology, let me just get my understanding of the historical reliability of the four Gospels. I'm going to learn history first. I'm going to learn about methodology. Right, now I've got that. They're reliable. They're really good sources. Now what do they say? Oh, brilliant. Okay, now I'm going to be a Christian. No one does that. No one does that. You take on Christianity for psychological reasons, and then you spend the rest of your life post hoc rationalizing, which is to say, I'm going to spend the rest of my life finding out how wonderful sources of evidence the Gospels are. Yeah. And I'm going to read all the books that tell me that the Gospels are brilliant sources of evidence, and then I'm going to tell everyone that no, it's a load of rubbish. Actually, they are extraordinary evidence, and the extraordinary claims are well justified by the extraordinary evidence. There you go. Job done.
It's amazing. It's like you just we make the decision up before we even start. It's
Yeah.
just it really brings up too this whole idea of if everyone around you is saying it's legitimate, it's really hard to buck that. Like that, a part of I'm learning more and more about that. Some
Swarm
people have
theory.
pointed out, yeah, but I mean,
That's
some people have pointed out the psychological, some studies that I need to figure out what they're doing, but psychological studies where they'll, for example, take they'll take 10 people, for example, and they'll put them in a room and they'll say, we're going to ask you some real basic questions that are just obvious, simple. Here's a paper with 2 lines, and are they the same or are they different? And everyone, of course, sees, oh, they're the same. So all 10 people say they're the same. And you go through a bunch of those, and everyone is agreeing. But then eventually you've told them the first 9 people at a certain point, I'm gonna go like this, and this means we're going into phase 2 of this test. I'm going to now bring up 2 lines. One of them is big, one of them is really tiny. And when I say, are they the same? I want the first 9 of you to say yes. And the test is actually for the 10th person who is now on the hot seat at the end saying, I've come to trust these people. We've agreed so much. Can I really buck the system now and say, no, all 9 of you are idiots? They're clearly 2 different lines. And when you get to that dynamic where you almost trick yourself into saying, if everyone else around me is saying this must be true, it must be real, people have told me they've seen the power of God, they hear God's voice, they've seen miracles. Maybe I don't hear that, but they can't all be wrong, can they? It's hard to buck that.
Yeah, they've done that with moral reasoning as well. So they've done that same kind of test, but with giving a moral evaluation. And people are sheep to different degrees. People will follow the crowd. So quite right.
It's amazing.
So people will believe what all the people around them are believing, and then and they'll listen to their elders and the people in their community who they believe are reliable and responsible and important. And it's a kind of this self-perpetuating thing. It's rare, well, not so rare now, people like yourself to kind of almost going the right way now, which is, okay, I've taken all this on and now I'm going to look at the evidence. Actually, I have a problem with the evidence, so I'm going to follow the evidence and make my conclusion. And now that conclusion is I need to drop what I previously believed because I followed the evidence and now I disbelieve. And that's the right way. Although you did it in the middle. I mean, we should all do that at the beginning of our lives. The problem is, if you're saying you should do that with Christianity, you should be doing that with all religious claims in the world. And none of us want to sit down and analyze the historical reliability or lack of reliability of all the religious claims in the world. We've got a life to lead. But essentially that's what we should do. We should do the history first and then say, oh, now what should we believe? But we don't do that.
Well, I love too just going back to, maybe we can start to wrap it up with a few final questions, but just the idea that this goes back, like you're dealing with the facts, you're dealing with the story and the history and the context and just what people really need to know as students. But you're also bringing in, again, the aspect of this is part of our human experience. We want to be resurrected. And I guess one of my final questions here would be, how do you deal with people that come to agree with you and say, yes, I agree, this story doesn't make sense, and maybe they're getting off of their apologetic high horse. They're saying, you're right, this whole William Lane Craig stuff that I was so sure of, I can see now this is ridiculous. The resurrection story doesn't make any sense, and this falls apart on every level. But instead, they kind of take their apologetics like, I'm gonna have better arguments. We're gonna kind of philosophically box here. And they kind of drop their gloves and they say, more like as a friend, like in the tippling philosophers kind of context, you're out there with the people with drinking a beer, and you see that they've kind of dropped their defenses and they've gone from being argumentative to just being a little bit sad, and their faces kind of forlorn a little bit, and they're like, shit, maybe this isn't real. And they're realizing like the waves of implications. How do you help people to kind of rebuild their sense of identity, their sense of just grounding, like, because it's kind of like we're pulling the carpet out from people's feet, and our goal is not to obviously, injure them, so to speak, metaphorically in that, but it is to say, you think you're on a magic carpet that's going to take you into some magical fairyland. There is no magic carpet; it's not there. And so when we kind of metaphorically yank this invisible carpet out, they feel like they're tumbling. and it does leave people with this question of, okay, so what's, if life isn't about attaining to the resurrection, then to agree with Paul, if the resurrection did not occur, then we are the most miserable of men. How do you start over? How do you advise people to start over at that point?
Well, it goes back to that whole God is functional. So it's understanding what function God provides. And then once you understand what that is, you can then talk about how do you replace that in people? How do you substitute something in for God in the hole that's left? Now, in Britain, if someone traditionally, we haven't had a very evangelical faith community here. So it's nominal Church of England stuff where you go and drearily sing a hymn every Sunday. And then generally it's all about tea and biscuits. And so, so people leaving that faith isn't a big thing, right? And so religion really hasn't been a big thing in Britain over the last century. America is a different kettle of fish. So you've got the Bible Belt of America and you've got evangelical Christianity, which is fundamentally different. And so when you leave that, you've got, or it's like leaving Scientology. You've got the threats of that community. You've got the psychology involved in that. You've got the social networking. You've got attribution of morality. How can morality be a thing without God? You've got explanation of things. The whole world is just turned upside down. And so if you leave that, then there might be some serious psychological problems. It's about communities. So this is why it's so great that there are atheistic communities or humanistic communities that are much more prevalent nowadays. You've got things like the Sunday Assembly, where if you want that togetherness with like-minded people, you can turn up on Sunday with other atheists and humanists and sing songs and be happy together in your belief system. And then there are things like my friend Dr. Caleb Lack, who's a psychologist, who's part of the Secular Therapy Project. So you've got people who can provide psychological assistance to those who are coming out of very difficult scenarios, familial and social networks, where leaving that is really difficult. So yeah, it's difficult. You've got to work out what the functions are that God does and provides, and be able to provide them in other ways, or at least minimize the impact of losing that. Like an afterlife, I can't promise you an afterlife, but don't worry. It just means we've got to celebrate this life a lot more, blah, blah, blah. And communities and friendships and reaching out to people. As you know, people solve people problems, not God.
Yeah, it brings out to me too the I guess what I might call the insidious side of religion, where for a lot of people, if you were to say this isn't true, their response would be, not everybody, but I've seen this before from some, if this isn't true, I don't know that I want to live in this life. Like, people are literally almost, at least metaphorically, suicidal, where they're like, what's the point if there's no God to live for, if there's no heaven to achieve? And it's like, it points out the poison of this, where it says it's like, it's very similar to me to the psycho God story, where it's related to like a really bad husband, where you've basically got a husband maybe that tells his wife, you're garbage, you're shit, no one could ever love you, but I'm going to kind of give you value, because I'm gonna be here, and he maybe beats the shit out of her physically or at least emotionally, and she ends up with this mentality of, yeah, I'm really nothing, and if I don't have him to be my guy, no one's gonna love me, no one's gonna take me, I'm just worthless, I'm not beautiful. And so the idea of stepping away from this psycho God, the psycho husband, and saying, actually, no, I can claim my own power. I can claim my own respect, my own worth. I can make decisions for myself without someone else having to be, I don't have to check and obey as someone else. I'm the one that I check with myself, and I trust myself. That empowerment, it's really hard when you've been beaten down. And it's like, you almost have to tell people, like, look, you have been given an opiate, so to speak, that's told you this construct. If this isn't true, your life is meaningless. And it's like, you have to almost, like, that in that movie, Men in Black where they have the flashy thing and they're like, hey,
Yeah.
look here, everybody,
Yeah.
and you see it and they forget what happened. You almost have to like have a scope for the imagination to go back and say, what would my life have been like if I had never, if theoretically, if I could have amnesia and have never been through this, what would I have been like? Well, I would have enjoyed science more. I would have
Yeah.
still looked at the stars and enjoyed them. I would have still loved people. I would have still learned to respect and work with my community. And I would have maybe, pursued art and this. I just wouldn't have done it for the Yahweh character, and I wouldn't have done it for his approval. I wouldn't have done it in the slave mentality, like I need to give him glory through this. And as you slowly find ways to imagine what it would have been like if he wasn't there, it kind of, at least to me, it creates a context for you to begin to recreate and say, okay, what it would have been like without the God character, excuse me, with his abusiveness and all this blood magic stuff, I can start to just slowly pull the roots out. It's a long process, but this is like roots of a tree. They're deep. But just pull what you can and begin to imagine what life would have been like if it had never been there, and then recreate the best life you can. And I think eventually you get to a point where you realize, even though it felt like, oh, this feels like awful. Where's God in this? Where's the hope and the peace and the meaning? You begin to realize that it was like, the cave, you're looking at the shadows of Plato's cave. And now that you're out, you're like, it felt like that was so real to me. But now that I'm out of the cave, I wouldn't go back for anything. And I feel like that to me is maybe it wouldn't help other people, but to me it's very healing to realize you're
Yeah.
in a prison, you don't see it, but when someday you will realize this prison's not worth going back to.
Yeah, I think there's loads of interesting stuff in there. And I think it is almost like, coming out of some drug-induced trance or something, or where the kind of cataracts of illusion, when you peer behind the curtain and Oz, the reality hits you. I get that. But as an interesting point you said about empowerment. So when you talk about things like meaning of life, I've written essays before on say the meaning of life. So God has a purpose for us. Well, what if my purpose doesn't align with God? This idea that I'm having someone thrust upon me their purpose and their meaning for me. And I love that atheism or humanism allows us to take that power back to us and to dictate our own meaning and purpose in life. And I think it's far nobler to create from nothing, from everything around you. So from nothing, but from everything, your own narrative and your own meaning in life and your own purpose. I think that's far nobler than to just obsequiously take on whatever supposedly some invisible deity is dictating should be your meaning and purpose. And I think so. I think that I think that encapsulates a lot when you talk about that. So you got that empowerment, and the same, taking back from that community, maybe an oppressive religious community, just taking back that power back to yourself and say, no, I am going to forge my own path and work out my own moral framework and understanding of what's good in the world around me. And I think it is empowering and as well as enlightening.
And I would just add to that too. It's when you think about like the God character telling you and dictating to you, but when you really dig in, like you've done into the history behind all this, and there's a lot more to it, but you've taken this one focus. But when you really dig into how this evolved, both from the characters that they used to create the Jesus character, but also just the church, the canonicity of the church history, that there were, as we know, many different versions of Christianity, and there wasn't one. There were many different versions, and so it isn't even like we're saying God was dictating to you. What we're saying is there was a group of men, probably literally men, not mostly women, but men who dictated and who fought and literally probably beat and killed and burned manuscripts, and they fought to get this one storyline to become orthodox. And then from there it evolved heavily and got redacted and so forth over hundreds and at this point thousands of years. So it isn't like God was even dictating. What you're talking about is a spirituality that was dictated by some pretty nasty men and overseen by some other very powerful men. And so you're not giving up God, you're giving up a version of spirituality from men that, like, why would someone else's spirituality, someone that's long dead and arguably were making horrible decisions, and they couldn't say slavery is wrong, they couldn't say genital mutilation is wrong, they couldn't say all this stuff. why would you take on their spirituality and let
Yeah.
it dictate your entire identity?
Which is why I think there's an importance in doing books like this and my Nativity one, and hopefully the Exodus one, which is to say that if you're basing all of that, those revelations and how we should live our lives on these supposedly historical pillars, and we can knock down those pillars quite conclusively, in my opinion, then you have nothing. You've got nothing left. You have this, what I call a castle in the air. You've got this building with no foundations, and it's just, there's no reason to believe that. And that's why I think, you know, I'm particularly proud of this book. It's 300 pages of, I've tried to be concise. I've tried to distill everything down, pick holes right across the Gospels and Paul, but also look at the theology and the philosophy and the historicity and methodology, and show that no, this is not reasonable to believe this, and therefore everything else that comes with it, all the 2,000 years of people telling you X, Y, and Z, it's all nonsense. You know, there might be some good stuff in there, in the fact that, you know, there are good teachings in all religions, but we as humans use our moral reasoning to pick and choose what those good teachings are.
Yeah.
You know, they're not good because God has told me through you. You know, that's not what makes them good. What makes them good is my ability to morally evaluate them and see whether they're good or not on the basis of moral reasoning.
Yeah.
Yeah, we started getting into divine command theory here, but you know, yes. So I think, yeah, there you go.
Yeah, and I think a lot of it too, it boils down to, for those of us that got out, it does feel like you escaped. It's like you escaped the matrix. It's a hard pill to swallow. You know, why didn't I take the other pill? Why did I take the red one? But you know, some people would rather, like we talked about last time, would rather get plugged back in and just have their blind ignorance of where this came from. But for those of us that escaped, it does feel like there's just so much peace in knowing what I was in and what my life is really about, getting back to ultimate reality, to, you know, to the truest reality that we can. You know, there's a lot we don't know, obviously, about the universe, and that's an awesome challenge. But even that, to be able to be free to take science and look at the world and the universe around us and say, I can now do it without the scales of this bizarro religion. I can just truly try to absorb as much of reality as I can for the first time. And that's why a lot of atheists say, I had so much peace. And I don't think Christians can understand that, but it's like, you feel like you kind of won the lottery because you know how hard it was to get out, and you did escape a prison. And as much as some of us might want to get back in and then just be like, I just want ignorant bliss of the heaven to come. To know that I'm actually in reality, that I have one life to live, and that's it, most likely, that there's probably nothing coming after this, that I can now take much more firm control over the time I've got left and leave this planet better than I found it. And that to me gave me so much peace immediately. And just to know that I'm not shackled.
Yeah, that's a great encapsulation of that empowerment we were talking about. That is it in a nutshell. Yeah, absolutely perfect. I got goosebumps half the way through that. So yeah, I think you're absolutely right, mate.
Yeah. Well, did I to wrap up, was there any other aspects of the book or any other points you wanted to talk about?
Yep, there's about an hour's worth of other aspects, mate. So
we can do another session. Was there anything else for this session that you wanted to point out?
I without your listeners wanting to slit their wrists in like terminal boredom, probably not. Just, you know, it's interesting the number of different naturalistic theories for the resurrection. I mean, I broadly sketched out one, which is either Jesus was stoned and then hung up and taken down, or he was just stoned straight away. That means stoned to death, obviously, no illegal drugs involved. And he was then either he was buried straight away in some kind of criminal's graveyard, or he was taken by a pious Jew, not Joseph of Arimathea, but someone, because it was strict Jewish procedure, and actually they did have jurisdiction to do this under Roman rule, to take down bodies who had died on the cross before sunset. Okay, so they might have been taken down, buried somewhere, and then just temporarily until, you know, Sabbath was over or the next day or whatever, and were then able to be buried properly in the criminal's place. And then they either his followers didn't know where he's buried at all, or they did know, and then it was moved, and then it seemed like it disappeared. Either way, you've got embellishments and legendary embellishments of what actually happened, throw in some hallucinations, and you've got the resurrection story. And that's really plausible. That's really plausible.
Yeah.
You've got the cognitive dissonance of his believers going, oh, what's happened? This is terrible. Oh my goodness, let's go back and take on all those ideas that you were talking about that could be in there. We've got ideas, and this goes for the next 200 years. We've got ideas of theology that's come from here. We've got some Gnostic ideas. We've got this, we've got that. We've got stuff from Enoch. We've got stuff from the Old Testament. And all this is going to be fed into how I interpret the Jesus story that I've received from my fellow cult sect followers. And then you just get this construction of a Jesus that happens over time until you're in 2021, and you have this Jesus in the Bible that people have post hoc rationalized all sorts of stuff onto, and it's not really true.
Yeah, that's amazing stuff. Well, I just want to say thank you for doing this. I mean, everyone, again, this is the book, The Resurrection, Jonathan M.S. Pierce. Please pick it up. You did a great job. You dealt with so many details, but you keep it moving. You keep it at a level where if someone truly has never done this kind of research before at any level, most likely 9 out of 10 things are going to make sense to you. There's a couple of things where, you have to do a little bit of digging and thinking, but for the most part, you leave it at a spot where if you're a complete newbie and you really want to understand this, you're probably going to understand everything in this book. And it's going to inspire you, though, to say, okay, well, some of this stuff is a little deep. So what does this mean? Let's dig in deeper into certain aspects. But anyone can pick it up and understand that this story, the resurrection, does not add up, does not make sense, and has so many holes in it. And I appreciate you doing it. And I look forward to your next book. Is the next one Moses, or is that?
Yeah, Exodus. Yeah, so it'll be the Exodus, I think. I think, I'm planning on writing that with Rebecca Bradley, who's an archaeologist, fellow skeptic. So that's a project. I don't know how far down the line, but certainly. I also want to rewrite my free will book, because that was my first book, and it could do with a damn good rewrite.
Nice.
As you improve as a writer.
Well, I would say you're definitely predestined to rewrite that.
Hey.
Exactly. Well, Jonathan M.S. Pierce, thank you so much for doing this. Thank you for your books, your story, your interactions, and I look forward to the next time. Let's do it again.
Yeah, always a pleasure, Tim. Always a pleasure. Thanks, mate.
Likewise. Thanks.